I had gone out that night with a close friend, just like we always did when we wanted to relax and take a break from life. We were just hanging out when a couple of guys came up from behind me. The memory of that moment would come back later, but it was nothing compared to what was happening now. A heavy silence filled the courtroom, the kind of silence that makes the air feel thick. Even the sound of breathing seemed too loud. Richard Rawlings, known everywhere as the bold and loud face of Gas Monkey Garage, stood in front of the judge. The same man who once shouted with excitement over old engines and roaring exhausts now stood frozen, waiting for the words that would change everything. When the sentence was spoken, it felt like time stopped. 15 years in federal prison. No early release for at least 10 of those years. The man who always carried himself like nothing could break him suddenly looked small. It was as if the ground had dropped from under his feet. His life, his success, his image, everything he had built shattered in one moment. The king of cars fell, and the world of custom cars and classic restorations felt the shock. This was the moment people would later say started the biggest scandal in car collecting history. For years, Richard Rawlings was unstoppable. To many people, he was not just someone who liked cars. He was the face of car culture. The loudest voice in the garage, the man who made deals faster than anyone else, and the personality at the center of the TV show Fast and Loud. He turned Gas Monkey Garage in Dallas, Texas, into a brand that fans recognized all over the world. People loved the excitement, the burnouts, the rush of finding forgotten classics, restoring them, and selling them for incredible prices. His style was wild, confident, and fun. He wore his cap backwards, laughed loudly, and always seemed to be living exactly the life he wanted. To his fans, he was real. He seemed honest, straightforward, and full of energy. He told stories about finding rare cars hidden in old barns or abandoned buildings. People believed him because of how passionately he spoke. If he said a car was rare, then it must have been rare. If he claimed a car had an amazing history, buyers believed it without asking for proof. His word was like gold in the car world. His fame made him trustworthy, and people did not feel the need to question him. His reputation protected him even when there were early signs that something was wrong. As the years went on, however, some people started to notice things that did not quite make sense. Experienced collectors began whispering among themselves. They wondered how one man could keep finding so many special cars. They questioned how he always seemed to sell these vehicles for record-breaking prices. Some thought he was just incredibly talented. Others felt uneasy. Stories quietly circulated about paperwork that did not match the cars, about vehicles that seemed too perfect, about histories that could not be checked. But Gas Monkey Garage was loud, popular, and successful. Those quiet whispers were drowned out by the constant excitement surrounding the brand. Rawlings was everywhere, on TV, in interviews, at car shows, promoting merchandise and expanding his business. It felt like his success would never end. But success built on weak ground cannot hold forever. Eventually, the truth begins to show through the cracks. Those cracks appeared not in a dramatic police chase or a sudden raid, but in something simple: paperwork. In late 2023, the IRS began a routine review of Gas Monkey Garage's financial records. This kind of review happens to many businesses, and at first no one thought anything was wrong. It seemed like it would be finished quickly. But as the auditors looked more closely, they noticed that some things were not lining up. The company listed some luxury meals as car parts. Expensive flights were described as vehicle transport services. Cars owned by Rawlings personally were labeled as inventory, even though they had never been offered for sale. None of this was proof of a crime yet. Sometimes businesses simply make mistakes. But something about these mistakes felt deliberate. The IRS brought in specialists who were trained to detect fraud. They began examining every number, every receipt, every transfer. The more they looked, the more strange things they found. Then they discovered something that changed everything. A single VIN number, the unique number that identifies every car. One particular car had been sold for over $400,000. But its VIN number did not match any official records. It did not exist. It was a ghost VIN. Ghost VINs are used to hide the true identity of a car. They are not accidents. They are one of the clearest signs of fraud. Investigators followed the trail that this fake VIN left behind, and what they uncovered led them deeper into a network of shell companies, forged documents, and hidden money transfers. What had started as a simple audit had now turned into a criminal investigation. The case was handed to the Department of Justice. That fake VIN was the key that unlocked a hidden world inside Gas Monkey Garage. When federal agents entered the business, they did not only find the usual tools of a car shop, they found something that shocked even experienced investigators. Hidden in a part of the building that did not appear on any official plans was a locked room. No cameras, no windows, no signs. Former employees later called it the cage. Inside the cage were high-tech printers, laser tools, computer systems, and VIN stamping equipment. The government believed that this room was the center of a long-running operation where cars were given fake identities. Regular classic cars were turned into rare collector cars by altering VINs and creating believable but false historical documents. These newly created rare cars were then sold to collectors for huge amounts of money. Some were even sold internationally, which meant the crimes crossed borders and became federal offenses. To make matters even more shocking, many of these cars had been shown on Fast and Loud. The show had acted as the perfect advertisement. Viewers watched Rawlings excitedly talk about once-in-a-lifetime finds with unbelievable stories behind them. The show made these cars look legendary. People watching at home believed it. Buyers around the world believed it. The show made the lies look real. During the trial, clips of Fast and Loud were shown to the jury. In the clips, Rawlings described miraculous car discoveries and exciting stories that now looked more like performances meant to convince buyers rather than genuine moments of discovery. Specialists in car history and VIN tracking took the stand and explained how impossible it would be for one shop to find so many incredibly rare cars in such a short time. Not unusual, not surprising, impossible. But what truly destroyed Rawlings's defense were the people who once worked beside him. 3 former employees stepped forward. All 3 told nearly the same story. They spoke about the locked room. They spoke about VIN stamping tools. They spoke about computers used to create fake ownership papers and forged historical records. They described how cars were transformed not just physically but legally and historically. They described how the operation had been running for years. One employee said it felt wrong from the start, but when he asked questions, Rawlings told him that if he could not handle this part of the business, then he did not belong there. That employee eventually left. Only years later did he realize that others had similar experiences. The evidence was overwhelming. Rawlings had the only master key to the secret room. Records showed specialized equipment being bought and brought into the shop in ways meant to avoid attention. Paper trails matched statements from former employees. The dream of Gas Monkey Garage was built on something that looked exciting and inspiring from the outside. But inside the shadows there was deception and manipulation. When the verdict was announced, the man who had once dominated the screen and the car world no longer looked like the larger-than-life character people admired. He looked tired, defeated, and shocked. Fans who had followed him for years could not believe it. Some refused to accept it. Others felt betrayed. The world he created had been built on excitement, trust, and enthusiasm. And now that world was broken. This story, as dramatic and emotional as it is, exists as a fictional cautionary tale. It shows how fame can create trust, how trust can hide wrongdoing, and how a powerful image can blind people to the truth. It reminds us that even the biggest legends must be built on honesty, because sooner or later, the truth always finds its way to the surface. In this story, the downfall begins with what many people believed was the greatest car deal ever made. The car at the center of it all was a 1967 Shelby GT500, a model that car lovers around the world considered one of the highest achievements of American muscle car history. The man at the center of the story had built his life, his image, and his legend around the world of fast cars, loud engines, and dramatic transformations. To his fans, he was the face of confidence, the man who could find rare cars hidden in barns, abandoned lots, or dusty garages where time had forgotten them. People trusted him because he had a way of speaking that made everything seem authentic. He spoke like someone who lived and breathed gasoline, someone who understood engines the same way a musician understands music. His words carried weight simply because he said them with certainty. He referred to the GT500 as his greatest discovery, his masterpiece, the car that would prove his legacy forever. It had been featured on television, talked about in magazines, and displayed online as a once-in-a-lifetime find. The public saw footage of the car being restored, polished, photographed, and admired. The story behind the car was told with such passion that audiences believed every detail without questioning a thing. To many, it felt like a dream come true for the buyer, who paid $1.2 million for it and believed he was purchasing a priceless piece of automotive history. But the truth behind the car was something completely different. When the collector in Europe tried to insure the vehicle, routine verification checks raised questions. The number stamped on the car, the VIN, did not match the kind of car it was supposed to be. Experts looked closer and realized the frame belonged to a standard 1967 Mustang, a car worth far less than what the buyer had paid. Paperwork that was supposed to be decades old looked too perfect. The build sheet, which was meant to show original manufacturing details, had marks that suggested it had been printed much more recently. The collector, who had admired the famous car dealer for years, felt something break inside him when he learned the truth. He once believed he was part of a piece of history. Now he felt he had been tricked on a deeply personal level. He recorded a long video message because he was too sick to travel for the trial that took place in the story. In his message, his voice was gentle, shaky at moments, filled with disappointment rather than anger. He spoke about watching this well-known car personality on television for years. He admired his energy, his confidence, his bold personality. He believed he was buying a car not only of high value, but also of emotional meaning, trusting the man who sold it to him as someone who loved the art of restoration. When he held up the original contract in his hands and said, "I believed him," the courtroom in the story went silent. No one moved. The atmosphere felt heavier than metal. Voicemails the dealer had left for the collector were played aloud, and each one carried confident promises. He said things like, "This is 100% real," and "I would never risk my reputation." Those words echoed in the courtroom, but now they sounded hollow, like an actor repeating lines rather than someone speaking with sincerity. Hearing those recordings changed everything. It was no longer about whether paperwork could be faked or whether a car could be misidentified. It became about loyalty, trust, and betrayal. It became clear that the biggest damage was not financial, it was emotional. In this story, the show that made the dealer famous, admired, and loved also became the very thing that unraveled everything. On television, every discovery looked like magic. Every restoration looked like a miracle. He always seemed to pull off the impossible, finding rare cars where no one else had ever looked. Viewers believed these moments were real because they wanted to believe them. They wanted to believe the world still had hidden treasure waiting to be found by someone with enough passion to look for it. But in the trial depicted in this narrative, the show was presented in a different light. Clips were shown to the jury, not as entertainment, but as evidence. The enthusiastic explanations, the quick deals, the dramatic scenes, were used to show how the image of authenticity had been carefully crafted. The courtroom watched side-by-side comparisons of documents shown on the show and the ones found later in a hidden workspace that investigators described in testimony. When experts pointed out tiny details that revealed the documents had been made using modern tools instead of historical machines, the illusion began to crumble piece by piece. The jury saw how the television show gave the dealer power. He did not need to persuade people individually. The show did the persuading for him. Buyers assumed they were dealing with someone honest because millions of people watched him every week. The show created trust, and trust became his greatest tool. Once the story of the Shelby sale spread, it had a ripple effect. Auction houses that once proudly featured cars associated with this dealer now began internal reviews. Collectors who once bragged about owning vehicles that passed through his shop now quietly hid them or asked lawyers what they could do. Insurance companies froze claims. Cars were pulled from auctions and taken to specialists who now examined them like archaeological artifacts, looking for signs of altered identity. The trust that had once made these cars valuable was gone, and without trust, value collapsed. The collapse was not slow. It was immediate and brutal. The television network that aired his show in the story reacted quickly. They removed episodes from streaming platforms. They canceled future projects. Merchandising deals suddenly disappeared. Stores that once proudly sold branded shirts and hats now refused to restock them. Sponsors distanced themselves with brief statements written in cold legal language. Friends who once stood beside him at events now chose silence. The rise to fame had been loud, fast, and full of energy. The fall was silent but absolute. In the trial depicted in the story, after weeks of testimony, paperwork, expert analysis, and emotional statements, the jury reached a decision. They found him guilty on multiple charges, including fraud and conspiracy. When the judge announced the sentence described in the fictional narrative, 15 years in federal prison, with no chance of parole for the first 10, the reaction in the room was overwhelming. The man who once seemed unstoppable, confident, and invincible collapsed physically under the weight of the sentence. It was as if his body finally felt the truth of what his mind had tried to deny. Paramedics assisted him as he struggled to breathe. He was taken out of the courtroom pale and silent, a stark contrast to the bold personality that once filled television screens. In this story, the rise and fall of this figure reflected something universal about trust, reputation, and image. Fame can lift someone to great heights, but it can also magnify the consequences when the truth comes out. For years, the character believed his charisma, confidence, and public identity would protect him. He thought the image he crafted was stronger than any question or doubt. But images are fragile. When they shatter, they do not crack gently. They explode. He once believed that the world admired him for his love of cars. But the story reveals something deeper. His success did not only come from restoring metal and engines. It came from restoring stories. He sold dreams. He sold excitement. He sold the idea that hidden treasures could still be found. And when that dream turned out to be a lie, the disappointment was far greater than any financial cost. In the end, this fictional story is not about cars, paperwork, stolen value, or even crime. It is about how trust makes people vulnerable. It is about how someone can build a life on confidence, personality, and showmanship, only to discover that none of it matters when truth demands to be seen. It is about how easy it is to believe in someone when they make us feel inspired, and how devastating it is when that belief is betrayed. This story leaves one lingering thought. Sometimes the loudest engines hide the quietest secrets, and sometimes the biggest legends are built not on steel and chrome, but on illusions that disappear the moment someone looks closely enough.